It's really about having things that are measurable and auditable. It's about incorporating ESG into all aspects of investing and also being clear on sort of where the weighting is for specific investments. Not every wind farm is a good wind farm from an ESG perspective. And so, really being intellectually honest with ourselves, right? Like just because it's a renewable power asset doesn't mean it's a great ESG investment. And so really always thinking about it holistically and then being able to document how that ESG layer is incorporated into the origination and evaluation of investments.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today is a veteran of the renewable energy industry, having been active in developing renewables assets for over 20 years, which is something very few people can say. He's the global head of renewables at the world's largest asset manager. And outside of this role, he served as the chair of the board of the American Council of Renewable Energy and on the board of the American Wind Energy Association. He's previously led regional teams in the Americas and Asia Pacific for BlackRock. So he has expertise across a variety of markets. My guest on the show is David Giordano, global head of BlackRock's renewable power business. Welcome, David.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, very much looking forward to it. Now, before we start talking about the industry, I'd like to spend a few minutes on your career. As I said, you've been doing renewables longer than most people have. Can you say a bit about how you decided to enter the renewable sector so long ago, so early in its evolution?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It still puts me back a little bit to think about the number of years. So many of us have been focused on this space, yeah. So as I think about the trajectory of my career, it's sort of the combination of, I think, being fortunate to be given some really interesting opportunities along the way, and then I don't know if you'd call it vision or just just naivete, but also just following what I was interested in. And so as I sort of go through the trajectory, I started my career really in demand side management. And then after I got a master's in public administration that focused on energy and environmental policy, I was fortunate enough to begin to work with a team that was actually working on recovering waste coal and re-agglomerating that qualified for some tax credits and then was able to be sold back into the traditional coal markets. And that was a Section 29 tax credit. Sort of fast forward to my later days with FPL Energy, now NextEra, and I really found myself keenly interested in what they were doing back in the late 90s and early 2000s in the wind space. And as we thought about things to do with that business, one of the things that was being contemplated was just how to finance that business in the public markets or more broadly in the capital markets. And so some of the structures and concepts that were utilized in the synfuel, the coal-based waste coal recovery deals was applicable to what we now see as the partnership flip models that we use for wind projects, and the tax equity financings that are used for solar projects here in the US. And so, I think a real interest in environmental and energy policy, a real interest in renewables generally. And then I think, just being fortunately exposed to some financing structures really kind of gravitated me towards that business. And I think back to the first wind power conference that I went to in Austin back in 2002. And I think there were about 500 participants at that conference. And so been able to see a huge maturation of the industry at a global scale over the course of my career. I'm always hesitant to raise this, but I do think part of the origin story is maybe growing up a few miles away from 3 Mile Island. So I think energy was sort of embedded into my soul at a very early age during that event, and just seeing the impact that power generation can have on a community.
What are your memories? Interesting, and thanks for raising it. I didn't know that. What are your memories from that period in history? You're very close to 3 Mile Island. What were the vivid? You're presumably quite early in life. What are your vivid memories of sort of what was happening at the time?
Yeah, the most vivid memory I think was the bag packed that my parents had by the front door, as if we could somehow, make an escape in our Chevy Malibu Classic station wagon and beat the catastrophe, which is sort of funny to think about. It just was such a dominant story. Obviously, it was dominant on a national level, but certainly at a local level. I think I was one of 3 kids remaining in my 4th grade class. Everyone else had left the area, it was just very interesting, to be kind of at the center of what was such a huge national story. Having to sort of at least be familiar with what was going on because it was such a big deal. I just think it was just, I think my memories were just that of trying to understand exactly what was going on. I mean, just like a little kid would do, and just being sort of sensitive to it, and then see the skits on Saturday Night Live making fun of it, and having it all be just kind of part of something that I experienced in real time and that everybody else sort of watched through the news.
And it's interesting. I mean, I see this in Europe, right? So the UK, for example, Great Britain building a new nuclear reactor and looking to build out an industry. Any conversation I have in Germany, which is not far away, has over the last decade has been very anti-nuclear. And the facts aren't different, but I think what often gets lost in this debate is sort of the perception of risk, and the Cold War history and all of that. Actually, it does impact people's well-being. And your average German is a lot sadder being near a nuclear power station than your average Brit. And to some extent, the facts don't matter and the probability doesn't matter. And that's the level at which sometimes the debate happens. But I think that often misses kind of how voters feel in general. So it's an interesting glimpse into sort of how the existence of nuclear power impacts people's well-being, even if the facts are, say, it's a pretty safe source of energy in general.
Yeah, no doubt. And look, we've got a lot of history, right? Whether it's Chernobyl or Fukushima, I think that probably the challenge is that it's, while the risk might be incredibly small, the impact is incredibly large. And so I think that plays into it. The thing, and I know we'll get into this more, and I think this is true across all infrastructure. There's such an overlay with power generation and the power grids and infrastructure more broadly and public policy. And the thing that I feel like gets lost so much is we spend an awful lot of time focusing on how public policy influences renewable penetration into the markets. But the reality is that public policy affects all infrastructure investing, and certainly has been the biggest driver of power generation technologies over the course of history.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and I suspect I'd like to talk a bit about networks, and that's an area where policy is a really important driver. Can I ask just quickly, looking back on the last 20 years? How you talked a little bit about it. How's the process of deploying capital in renewables changed over that period of time?
Well, first and foremost, right, it's so much more part of the mainstream of investing and deploying capital into infrastructure. It was very niche oriented, early on. If you go back to sort of the early 2000s and even up and through 2010 or even 2013, it's been it's sort of been a gradual evolution that kind of then happened all at once as you think about kind of the last 8 or 10 years. I think that the other thing that we've seen is just, a higher level of sophistication and efficiency in deploying capital into the space. It was very, very difficult to sort of find projects that were truly bankable, truly financeable. And so it was a much more, I'd say, project specific balance between, how the projects were financed, whether they were, fully balance sheet financed like they were by many of the big strategic players early on in the industry, to now, where we've got, an entire, subsector of infrastructure investing and lending, and here in the US, tax equity financing, offtake contracts and various types of offtake contracts. It's just the level of sophistication has increased so much, and the number of opportunities has increased. But the fundamentals still remain the same, right? Good projects attract capital, and as you move further out the spectrum, that's where you have to be more creative and think, a little differently about how to bring financing as you either take on more risk on the offtake side or on the technology side.
Do you think the risk balance? So if you were to say there's sort of development risk and then there's market risk, do you think the balance of those two risks has changed over time? And I don't know in which direction, but you might imagine as for example, with offshore wind, the development risk has declined massively over the last 5 to 10 years. People are very comfortable that they're going to make it work. Has that balance between those two types of risks changed over the period, do you think?
I think people's perception has changed over time. I don't know that anything really has fundamentally changed, though, about the risks, right? Mm-hmm. In development, you're always going to have some really binary risks out there, where a project either can move forward or it cannot move forward, or it cannot move forward economically because of some cost that particular site would incur if you were to build out a project. I think the volatility that we see on the commodity side has been, I think more challenging to kind of capture. I think we sort of understand the development risks more now than maybe we even did, using offshore as the example. And I just think that, the commodity risk on the other side, there's so many factors that we don't control there. And so, when you think about making a 30, 40 year infrastructure investment with a more than half of that time period, with a forecasted, not contracted revenue stream that has not behaved, necessarily as we would imagine it, with the various experts out there over that time period. I think that has created probably more challenges over the medium to long term.
Yeah. And I suppose the contract tenors with counterparties and with governments is declining as well. So even in the absence of that volatility, it's probably a bigger chunk of the revenues, that market risk. So I don't think very many people have raised more money than you and BlackRock have. How's the process of fundraising changed over this time? And the sorts of thing, I sort of audience education and knowledge of the market is one of the things on my mind. I suppose the ESG angle and what investors value is another thing on my mind. How would you're going out, you're asking people to invest in your various vehicles. How has that process changed over the last couple of decades?
The biggest change is, right, you're not starting from scratch when you go in and talk to somebody about the industry. If you go back even just if you look at the 11 years that we've been at BlackRock and you think about those early meetings that we had, in many cases, we were really starting from scratch to talk about the industry, sort of what happens when the wind doesn't blow, what happens when the sun doesn't shine. We were really talking about some of the basic fundamentals. We're sort of well past that for the most part now when we're talking to investors about coming into the space. And now it's really much more kind of about the velocity of the energy transition. And I think, the risk around obsolescence of technology as the technologies continue to evolve and change. We're spending a lot more time, sort of talking about some of those more specific issues directly around the industry than we were in the past. I also think the other piece of this is, the investors really see this as an important subsector to their overall investing, not just from a growth perspective, for in terms of the number of investments that will be available to be made, but I think that it's also, as they think about a sustainable portfolio of real assets, renewables really fits into that in a really important way. And so as they're thinking about all of their real assets and infrastructure investing, renewables just plays a much more prominent part kind of throughout the whole organization. It's not just, again, kind of a pocket or a nice to do, but a really important, I think, foundational component of a real assets investment strategy.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, excellent. So I'd like to zoom out now and talk a bit about the industry. I suppose the subject of the moment is the conflict in Ukraine. Do you have a sense? I mean, very early and policies are evolving and people are deciding how they want to interact with Russia in the future. Do you have any early glimpses of how you think this will impact the power industry, decarbonisation more broadly around the world?
We obviously all, I think, send sympathy, our well wishes. I mean, to really watch this conflict play out on TV is pretty striking. And I think the humanitarian component to this is by far the most important as we're sitting here right now in the early days of it. And I think as we think about it in terms of our industry, I mean, it's really just, again, and we saw a lot of this even during the pandemic, the energy security issues out there, play a bigger role when we're in these situations, whether it be the conflict in the Ukraine or whether it be, we're in a pandemic or some other natural disaster type issue. And so energy security, I think, becomes a really important issue. And, renewables obviously fit into that discussion quite nicely because they're, without the requirement of a feedstock fuel, there's, you're not reliant on, importing that fuel from any other sovereign country or, from any other region. And so that becomes, I think, an important part of the discussion. I think the other side of it is the decentralization of power generation and the flexibility that decentralization has. We've sort of built a power grid and built a system based on centralized generation that's then, pushing electrons out to the end user. And I think what we're seeing now is this evolution of a combination of sort of a hybrid model where you have some big centrally generated power, but then you also have the ability to self-generate inside the fence, whether that's with solar and storage. I mean, it could even be with your own, gas-fired or diesel-fired generators. But that ability to generate some power, right on site or extremely locally at the distribution level, I think becomes a much more, nuanced, if you will, part of the discussion around what the future of power generation looks like as it gets to the end user.
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds like one of your very early punchlines is, security has many dimensions, and perhaps what we thought, often this security debate, at least for me, plays out as renewables aren't a source of security. There's a trilemma because the wind doesn't always blow, and the best way to increase your security is have a nice dispatchable source of capacity. And to some extent, we're learning that that's not necessarily the case if your dispatchable source of capacity is not from a reliable place, or arguably there may not be any reliable places for that dispatchable capacity. Yes, it's interesting how it is playing out. Anyway, in any event, Good. Okay. Can we talk about ESG investing? It's been a topic on the podcast quite a bit recently. And my take on history, at least, is, probably up until maybe 6 months ago, 9 months ago, there are a huge number of people benefiting from valuation premiums for anything aligned with, ESG broadly. But there's a bit more scrutiny on that now when we're starting to ask more questions about what it means to be ESG compliant. Where do you think we are in terms of market maturity of ESG, particularly in terms of sort of measuring, evaluating performance of companies and funds? Where are we along the line here?
Yeah, I think we're still at the very early stage. I mean, I think we're in the sort of beginning of the beginning, if you will, when it comes to ESG. Really, I think what we saw was an acceleration of ESG as a component, or as a key kind of measurable aspect to investing, really come into focus over these last 2 years. And again, I think the pandemic really helped accelerate that as folks thought about the resiliency of their overall portfolios during that period. And so now we've got a lot of people talking about ESG. We have a lot of things being sort of labeled, with that, with ESG as either a priority or a focus of an investment strategy or for portfolio construction. And so the next phase is going to be really, maturing and making sure that we have, a common language around ESG first and foremost, right? I mean, maybe the environmental, the E part might be the easiest. As you get into, the social and the governance, I think it becomes, again, a little bit more depends on who you ask and how they define those things. And I think so coming up with kind of common definitions for all of the vocabulary words around it is going to be an important part of the evolution of ESG investing. And then it's really about having things that are measurable and auditable. It's about incorporating ESG into all aspects of investing, and also being clear on sort of where the weighting is for specific investments. Not every wind farm is a good wind farm from an ESG perspective. And so, really being, I think, intellectually honest with ourselves, right? Like, just because it's a renewable power asset doesn't mean it's a great ESG investment. And so really always thinking about it holistically, and then being able to document how that, ESG layer is incorporated into the origination and evaluation of investments. And then, maybe not even lastly, but just as importantly, is then how these projects are managed over the long term. And all of these, I think, again, we just need to create a much more, standardized, if you will, key performance indicators around this, and be able to really kind of compare things, across various projects, across various portfolios, and be able to have some confidence that what we're looking at, it has some consistency to it.
Yeah. So interesting. So yeah, central to your answer there was the common definitions, measurable, auditable, that sort of stuff. It feels like at the moment, if one measurement, there are different organizations that audit in different ways. If you don't like one guy's answer, you go to someone else. And if you don't like anyone's answer, right, you can just sort of bash your chest and tell the world that you are good, and maybe you don't even need an auditor on these things. Do you think we can? So to me, it feels like alignment means if you don't comply with the standards or whatever the common definition is, then it's going to be to your disadvantage. You're going to miss out on big pools of capital or something like that. So do you think we can get to that? Is this area, the E I'm talking about, really, the S and the G? I agree with you. I think that sounds harder. But do you think we really can get to those common definitions for what is good in E and what is not good in E? And if you think we can, what sort of timeline do you think we should be talking about? Where do you think we'll be in 2025, for example?
Yeah, look, I think we'll be much further along, right? This is not, it's it is complicated, but I think that again, as we create more and more transparency with some of the independent raters of these components to investments to projects, I think that we will make huge strides over the next 3-5 years in this space, and I think you will begin to see something where when you are going into an investor, you're going to have something very tangible to talk to them about in terms of your track record around these issues. And I think investors are just gonna insist on it, right? I mean, whether it's the insurance that's provided to the project, or it's the bank that lends the money to the project, or it's the equity investor, they're gonna want to be speaking the same language when they talk to each other and think about the risks around those investments. And then, from a portfolio context, we're all going to have to be thinking about our portfolio in terms of sustainability and resiliency. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is with good, transparent data to evaluate, those ESG components to those investments.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, and just one more question on this ESG bit. Do you think power-focused funds can straddle both fossil and non-fossil asset allocation? So, and the way I think about it is, power markets, gas generation and wind generation, they're taking quite similar market risks, right? It's the power price, it's similar drivers. So, in terms of the discipline of investing, I imagine it's not too dissimilar. But on the capital raising side, it feels like, you get, so some people want fossil assets, some people don't. Would your life be harder if you were going out trying to raise capital or deploy capital on both the renewable side and the fossil fuel side in the power sector?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you are. There are certain areas of the world, Europe being the most obvious example, right, where I think you're just seeing less and less appetite for investing into fossil fuel, even natural gas assets. I think as you move, into North America, I think you'll see, kind of much more of a all of the above approach, and that probably plays into, the ability to domestically supply some of those fossil fuels and not have that reliance on a foreign entity to provide the fuels. I think, in the Asia Pacific region, I mean, there again, we're continuing to see investment around fossil fuels just because there is, such a need for power, especially if we're moving away from nuclear, whether that be for, safety and technology reasons or just from speed to market considerations. You're still going to see transition fossil fuels be part of the mix. I think there is an ability to do that. I do think it's simpler, though, certainly for our business, that we aren't trying to straddle that, because I think the horizon is very different with those investments. And so whereas maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it might have been simpler to kind of straddle those, I think now you have to really have a view of what that asset is going to look like, over the medium to long term. And I think it's going to look very different for a fossil fuel asset than it is for a renewable power asset.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you think it helps on the talent attraction side of things? I mean, do you feel like you attract stronger candidates, and because of your environmental role in the world and decarbonisation?
Yeah, I don't want to necessarily say stronger, but I definitely think the pool is deeper. I do think that, as you think about the people that are coming into the energy industry now, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm. And, I know for our team, one of the biggest challenges that we have as a management team is making sure that we're creating enough opportunities for them to grow and think about, what is going to be the next big technologies that are important to the market. What are going to be the next important markets. And so you're seeing an awful lot of enthusiasm. I know we are, to the people coming in to the industry and really excited to be at the front end of the energy transition and be playing a role there. So I think it's definitely a very deep pool of really enthusiastic, smart, and dynamic young professionals out there that are really interested in this space.
You obviously, and we talked about it before, government has played a strong role in most markets in getting the renewable industry going. In the US, tax credits have been a big driver of renewables build out, as well as investments in transmission and those types of things. In Europe, it's been long-term contracts, whether feed-in tariffs or contracts for difference. In Australia, there's been LGCs or some sort of renewables credits to hit a target. Having been in the industry for a while, do you have a sense of which risks you think government should be taking and which risks government shouldn't be taking in power markets?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And if you think about the sort of on the history side, you've got this you've seen policy play such an important role in facilitating investment into the space, whether it be with the long-term feed-in tariff contracts that we saw in Europe, or just the tax credits that we have in the US. We're seeing the countries in Asia utilize the feed-in tariffs as a way to attract capital and developers into that space, and that is a great tool to create certainty and facilitate the right cost of capital for infrastructure projects into a specific jurisdiction. I think as we kind of now move into this next phase of penetration, where we're really talking about the broader energy transition, I think it becomes much more about market structure and facilitating the tangential infrastructure for the build out of the power generation, right? I think we really know what that is and what that takes. And I think we now have, whether it be through government programs or large end users, or even retail end users that want that access to renewable power as part of their, or the entirety of the power that they consume. And so now it's really about having the infrastructure in place to facilitate that broader energy transition, and that's transmission lines. It's rethinking the distribution system. It's rethinking the metering. It's thinking about the market structure. I mean, the biggest barrier for large scale, utility scale battery storage, is having a revenue structure that works for that type of storage. And so, I think that as policymakers look to the future, I think focusing on that facilitation of the supporting infrastructure for the transition is going to be the key, and that will be really where you'll see the biggest advances made.
To me, at least, it signals a shift from politics to policy in a sense as well. People will campaign on 40% renewables, 50% renewables. Biden, net zero grid by 2035. Politicians will tend not to campaign on power market structure or metering, and it tends to be left to the departments and the policymakers, and so I do think success. I entirely agree with the evolution, and we're going to need I think the markets with the good bureaucrats and the good governance around market reform will tend to do quite well. On just one question, the follow-up question on that, you talked about the role of batteries and the role of at least in my mind, one of the things that swayed me towards the virtues of nodal markets like in the US is congestion is reflected in a price rather than some centrally planned person deciding where we need these things. Do you think nodal markets have been a success from a deployment of capital perspective?
Look, I think having a strong, healthy market clearing function has been a success. And I think nodal markets have been an important tool in that. I definitely, think that finding the right parties to absorb the risks from, the node where a project generates electricity and puts it into the grid to then, how the power is priced as it makes its way to the end user. I think, that's that sort of basis differential. Not to be too wonky with the technical terms
fear
here,
not.
but
It's a wonky audience, so go for
okay,
it.
good. That basis differential is one that becomes requires experts like yourselves to really get underneath the hood, if you will, on those and really understand what that looks like in an ultimate realized revenue proposition for a project. So I think that there are some real benefits to that. I also think if you think about specific markets where that nodal structure really facilitates a much more granular look at the impact of increased capacity coming into the grid is a big benefit, right? And that's one of the challenges that you see in markets where maybe that they don't do that as specifically, that then you have projects sort of being left and become really challenged, and that they just can't get their power out to market. So I think the structure is useful. I think again, just like sort of a common theme that we keep coming back, but I think the revenue side of it is going to be very important, right? Because that's where capital markets will get spooked, right? When sort of things happen that aren't that aren't in the forecast and don't feel forecastable, is where you really start to run into challenges on the financing side.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we had Peter Crampton on. He's a professor, but he was also one of the ERCOT commissioners, and he sort of said, I'd much rather, he's a big nodal enthusiast, and he said, I'd much rather trust the algorithm, the transparent algorithm, than some sort of central policy decision. Although I'm not always sure that's the case, because as you say, some of these risks are unforecastable. Sometimes someone builds a solar farm next to yours, and there's nothing you can do to control that, and you just wonder whether that is the type of risk that the private sector should be bearing in some of these contexts. So anyway, at least from my perspective, not entirely clear cut. You talked about facilitating tangential infrastructure. Networks is a massive one here. You talked about transmission lines. Now, it's, as democracies have evolved, it's become harder and harder to build transmission lines. People just don't like them, and putting them underground is expensive. Do you think, for example, the US can build the transmission infrastructure that it needs over the next couple of decades? If you take the net zero grid seriously, maybe not 2035, but say 2045 or something like that, can the US build the high voltage transmission infrastructure that it will need to get to that point?
It's an interesting question. I think it goes back to sort of my idea that I think it's a bit of a hybrid model, right? I do think the decentralization of power generation and consumption will play a part in alleviating some of the need, right, for the big, high voltage transmission lines. And so I think that plays into this, and I think we will see much more sort of localized generation and distribution of electricity. That does not alleviate the need, though, to rethink, the high voltage transmission system around a very different, set of generation technologies. It's one of those where you sort of look at the dynamics today in the United States and you say, geez, I can't imagine a scenario where we could agree on something so big as that. But I also think we're going to have to. And so, it just sort of falls into that camp. Once it becomes an absolute emergency, then folks will find the will to absorb the costs, absorb the disruption of development in areas where maybe they've been undeveloped, and we will see it happen. Will it happen efficiently? probably not is really the answer, right? Which
Yeah.
maybe that's the right answer, to some degree. I mean, I do think, there is a real sort of environmental justice component that needs to be incorporated into the energy transition, and we can't just kind of go about it the way maybe we did 50 or 60 years ago. And so finding that right balance and taking advantage of the evolving technologies, I think will be a big part of that story. But we're just going to have to, at some point, there's just no choice.
Yeah. And on that point of will we do it efficiently? I mean, I think with these sort of things, it's like beware of people with big plans on this stuff. I think it's, I look at, California and Germany are both good examples where sort of the limit of the imagination of policymakers was, we'll put the wires underground. I think PG&E were doing that. I think the German government's been doing that, which is a phenomenally expensive way to build high voltage transmission. And there are alternate, distributed generation, as you say, bring the generation to the demand rather than the wires or batteries or there's all sorts of different ways in which this can be managed. And so I almost think the sort of stumbling along as technologies evolve and as we try different things and they interact differently with market structures may actually be the right move here. It's hard to know what will be the answer, but I think it's, if copper has been 100% of the answer to congestion in the past, it seems highly unlikely that it'll be 100% of the answer to congestion in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You've been so one other market structure question. So you've developed assets in both regulated, non-regulated markets. Do the requisite skills differ across those two? And for those not in the US, regulated markets, there tends to be one monopolistic load serving entity. Retail is probably what you'd call them in the rest of the world. And they will often offer long-term. They don't develop all of their own assets. They'll often offer a very long-term contract. Georgia Power might be offering 30-year contracts or something like that for people to build renewables in. Whereas a deregulated market, you have people investing, owning assets, and selling the power as and when they want. So sorry, David, segue on the context of the question, but how do the skill sets differ, if at all, in developing assets in the two different types of market in the US?
Yeah, most of the skills are the same, right? Like it really just gets down to then, because, I think I said this earlier on, good projects with good resource, with the right land, with a robust interconnection point, regardless of kind of the market structure, unregulated or regulated, those projects get built. I think that, the key, and look, Japan's a great example, right? Like that's a highly regulated market. We've seen, huge policy incentives post Fukushima to facilitate the transition. And there it's really just, it sort of changes the skill set a little bit, right? Instead of originating an offtake contract, it's really being someone that's close to and understands the evolution of the policy, whether it's, how the feed-in tariff contract is going to be adjusted year over year, depending on the vintage of the project, to, how the rules might change around dispatchability and those kinds of things. So, it definitely, I think, is the skill set is different in that kind of last mile of development.
Yeah.
But the fundamentals, I think, are very similar.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And do you think in the US, the direction of travel is towards more deregulated markets, or are we at a happy point right now in terms of the balance?
Yeah, it's I think the role of the state globally is going to play a bigger role in the energy transition than maybe any of us that are investing in it right now are fully appreciating, because of the need, for investment in that, in the grid infrastructure, in the broader infrastructure to facilitate the energy transition. And so that's something we as investors, as asset managers, really need to continue to stay close to and pay attention to. I think that on the commodity side, and look, kind of to be determined on a global scale on how carbon plays into this whole discussion. Is there a global carbon market? Are they all regional? What happens there will also play into this and plays into the policy side of it. But I do think, if end users, if retail customers, really, really individual citizens, right, are experiencing kind of the volatility that those of us in the industry have sort of become somewhat accustomed to power pricing, I think that's where you'll see the role of the state increase, and maybe even a move towards more regulation. And so that's the kind of thing that again, as long-term investors, we really have to sort of stay sensitive to and kind of understand the direction of travel there. But I do think the role of the state, it's hard, I don't have a perfect prediction of where that's going to impact it, but I do think, regulation and the role of the state across all of our jurisdictions globally is going to continue to be, and in some cases, maybe even increase, an important part of the evaluation of investments.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I mean, I've got huge sympathy for it. But there is a bit of a straw man, or has been out there, which is sort of renewables are cheap. Renewables are the least cost source of power generation in a lot of places, which they are. In general, across the course of an LCOE basis or something like that. Therefore, government just needs to get out of the way. And from what I see, that couldn't be further from the truth. There are just so many areas at which government engages with the market in all sorts of ways to facilitate decarbonisation and security and these types of things. It wouldn't at all surprise me if the role of the state gets bigger. It's just not often you hear it in the space of the energy transition. Just finally on the hydrogen point, how are you thinking about, it's early days, probably Europe in some ways is most advanced, and that's because of a big chunk of COVID relief money, among other things. How are you thinking about hydrogen as an investment theme? What's investable in this space right now, if anything?
Yeah, for us right now, right, it's just a space that we're paying a lot of attention to. We're really focused on the green hydrogen. There's other strategies at BlackRock that are thinking more about blue hydrogen. We're really only oriented towards green hydrogen in our team. And I think that while we'll continue to look at it and pay attention to it, to me it feels a little like the early days of offshore wind or even LNG, right? There's a lot of discussion around it. I think there's more conferences than projects about the topic right now. And so, it's something to really continue to pay attention to. I don't know that we're quite at the stage for sort of, kind of core plus or even value add infrastructure investments make sense, just because the timing is so uncertain. But I don't think it's, I don't think we're 20 years away from these projects really becoming de-risked and moving into construction and then operations. I think it's over the course of these next 10 years.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I have a question on BlackRock, and then I want to ask you about a few concepts and whether they're overrated or underrated. So you've been, zoom back 20 years. There wasn't really such a thing, as an internet, or 25 years as an international, power sector investor. They were all very national. There were Germans, there were Brits, there were Americans, there were, different states in Australia had different companies. And sort of BlackRock's been at the vanguard, I think, of that global investment pool deploying capital across all of the world's regions in a particular power market theme. And as I said, you've probably raised more capital than almost anyone. How do you manage the diseconomy? Power market, as we said, government matters, policy matters. The rules within Texas are very different to the rules within California and are phenomenally different to the rules within Japan. How do you manage the diseconomies of scale that come with having that global reach?
Yeah, it's really key, and you hear the leaders at BlackRock, Larry in particular, talk about we're a global investor, but we need to be local in our investing. And for us, we lean very heavily on just having presence in the markets in which we're investing, both with partners as well as with kind of the broader BlackRock firm. So we really, look to take advantage of the experience that exists specifically in those markets and leverage that to kind of speed up, our education on the nuances of a specific jurisdiction. And then we've got to really, lean into those markets and add resources and participate, through industry organizations, through, meeting with and understanding the direction of travel of policymakers, of leaning into, the local economy where projects are located, the national economy in terms of just, the direction of travel in terms of in terms of demand for the power coming from the projects. And so it's really, I think it's a great point, and I think it's a real challenge, which is why I think, it's been one of our unique characteristics in raising capital, and that we do bring the opportunity for our partners to get access to a global portfolio. But with that means that we have to make the investment, in those regions that we are deploying capital, that we're managing assets, and making sure that we've kind of, that we've got the right, the right connectivity to those markets. It's a really key point. I mean, these are real assets, right? You're not just, trading public equities on an exchange here. You really have to be embedded in those markets. And so it means it's a big team, and it means it's a big network of partners, everyone from the local developers, to the global equipment manufacturers and OEM providers.
Okay, so to round it out, I'd like to ask you a couple of concepts in the energy transition and see whether you think they're overrated or underrated. So let me start. The role of markets in decarbonizing the power sector. Do you think it's overrated or underrated?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one a little bit, and I think it's overrated by the industry, and it's underrated by the policymakers. I really think that again, I think it's a combination of the two. And so I know that's kind of a non-answer answer,
No.
but I think that, we keep thinking that there's a market solution to bail us out. And so you're focused on that direction. And I think policymakers keep thinking the same thing. And so therefore they don't have to, create the structure to facilitate it. And so it's really a combination of the two. It's sort of overrated and underrated depending on which window of the house you're looking in.
It's a great way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it like that, but you think about policymakers. I mean, I've always said one of the great arguments for sort of infrastructure banks like the CEFC in Australia or the Green Investment Bank in the UK, or I suppose the Department of Energy sort of program that's being set up in the US now is, politicians like just picking winners and they like to cut ribbons and do things. So if you can have a body that enables that, but with sensible people kind of as a vetting arrangement, that's probably good. That it avoids the worst parts of kind of undermining markets. And I also said in Europe at the moment, there's just huge anger that the power price is determined by the marginal unit, which is economically the right answer. But that's gas. And so, without quite knowing what the answer is, there's a dislike of that might end up undermining markets from a politician's perspective. So I really like that answer. I think it makes the world make more sense when you think about it like that. Next concept, the role of gas as a transition fuel to a low carbon power sector. Do you think the role of gas as a transition fuel is overrated or underrated?
I think it's overrated. I think it's overrated. Again, I think that, it's really just a matter of, kind of the fortitude we have to lean into the transition. If we have less fortitude, then gas plays a bigger role. If we're, if we're willing to just sort of, take an honest look at it and say, those are going to be stranded assets in the sort of medium term at best. And so why bother? We might need to do a few things to help facilitate, at this stage, but it's ultimately cheaper in the long run. I think that would be a more sensible approach. So I do think it's overrated.
Yeah, interesting. And it is. You look at the cost of electricity in GDP, and it's not particularly large, right? There'll be tax credits and tax rate changes that have a bigger impact on hip pockets than gas as a transition fuel. So I in a sense, it feels doable. If the fortitude are there, as you say. The role of batteries to replace networks in reducing congestion and integrating renewables. Do you think that's overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated right now. I think that we're going to see a huge decline in the cost of batteries as electric vehicle penetration increases. And I think electric vehicle penetration is going to increase massively over the next 5 years. You've got a whole industry that certainly does not want to be building two technologies of vehicles for very long. And so as we see the cost of batteries come down, I think that you're going to, and the other thing too is, some of those batteries that might not have the efficiency to be in a vehicle might be perfect as sort of a spinning reserve, as part of a bank of batteries for a spinning reserve, for grid stabilization purposes. And so, there's also kind of a circular economy component to batteries in the overall sort of energy picture or energy transition picture. And so I think we're underrating that value right now.
Okay, interesting. And finally, the US's ability to hit net zero emissions across the economy by 2050, and that's across the whole economy, not just the power sector. Do you think that's overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated. I think that I think we're at that sort of stage right now where folks are uncomfortable with the transition. Change is hard. But I do believe that there is such a huge economic upside to the transition that once it really kind of gets its legs under it and the jobs really start to flow, I think you were already seeing organized labor play a bigger and bigger role in the discussion around policy for the energy transition. I think as folks see the economic opportunity that's there, I think you're going to see a massive acceleration in the US.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you do get these tipping points. I mean, slightly tangentially, one of the unions in the UK recently wouldn't unload a cargo of Russian oil this week. Now, that was on principle rather than on decarbonisation objectives. But I think you do reach these tipping points, and then things happen fast. Wonderful. Well, I think that's a good note to finish on. Thanks so much for sharing, your deep expertise from really the center of the global renewables industry. So David Giordano, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
Oh yeah, John, thanks so much for having me. It's great to get a chance to kind of think a little more philosophically and not be down in the weeds. So really appreciate the opportunity.
That was John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, talking to David Giordano, global head of renewable power at BlackRock. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.